Let's proceed to the next session, a panel discussion on the topic Legal Outlook on Effective Resolution Process and Transactional Audit in IBC. This discussion will touch upon points like S230 versus going concerns versus liquidation, key success factors to an effective Section 29A due diligence to avoid the risk of ineligibility, forensic technique to circumvent PUFE transactions during the resolution process, etc. Now, I would like to invite Zameer Nathani, Senior Vice President and General Counsel, UFO Movies India Limited, to moderate this discussion. He was a law firm attorney for Eureka Forbes, LG Electronics, TCL, India, etc., and also served as an Associate Vice President, Reliance Entertainment Head, Legal for Balajee Telefilms, and Director, Legal for Raymond's Limited. Over to you, Mr. Nathani.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to welcome my esteemed panel members and the audience to this high profile virtual business meet by Economic Times on legal outlook on effective resolution process and transactional audit in IBC as part of the panel discussions we have. My panel members are industry stalwarts. They are learned, they are well known speaker on the subject matter. I would like to introduce my panel members to you for the discussion. I will first introduce you to Anjali Jain, who's partner and head of Insolvency and Corporate Laws, Areness. Anjali is a partner and head Insolvency and Corporate Laws with Areness. She advises the firm's clientele on various insolvency, banking, and corporate law matters. She also heads the legal research division of the firm through comprehensive research aimed at improvising and making the insolvency and banking laws better suited to the country's economic and social circumstances. She's also actively involved as a resource person with several national law universities. My next panel member is Mr. Aravind Balajee. Aravind Balajee is Vice President Legal for Adani Group. Aravind, he is a highly experienced lawyer, having experience in working and advising on complex M&A, financing, restructuring, insolvency, and litigation matters. Aravind has previously worked as a senior legal counsel at Tata Sons and at various top-tier law firms in Mumbai, New York, and Singapore. He is admitted to practice law in India and New York and has an LLM, Masters of Law from Harvard University. My next panel member is Mr. Ramanand. He is Group Head Risk Management and Governance, Havells India Limited. Ramanand is the Group Head Risk Management and Governance at Havells. He is a chartered accountant having 20 years of experience in internal audit, risk management and governance, information and cybersecurity, SAP and GRC implementation, forensic audit, etc. With proven leadership skill, he was instrumental in developing standard operating procedures for all business processes and workshop for its implementation across all locations for both domestic and international factories and sales offices. My next speaker is Mr. Ritesh Kumar, Executive Director, IndusLaw. Ritesh has a rich experience, professional consulting experience in various direct tax laws, including advising clients on fund structures, exchange control regulations and non-banking regulation, and handling complex transaction structuring mandates for mergers and acquisitions, fund structuring, group reorganization, and disposal of assets. In the course of his career, Ritesh has also previously been at a director at Ernst& Young LLP India for 11 years before joining IndusLaw. My next speaker is Mr. Anoop Rawat, who's partner Insolvency and Bankruptcy, Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas and Company. Anoop is an integral part of the insolvency and restructuring practice of the firm. He has represented clients across various capacities, including resolution professionals, the committee of creditors, and the resolution applicants. In addition to insolvency and bankruptcy, he also represents a diverse clientele comprising of resolution applicants, foreign portfolio investors, Indian and foreign private equity players, and other strategic investors in evaluating investment through debt, equity, and or synthetic instrument in India as an Indian opportunity, and strategizing the investments inter alia for such investors through asset reconstruction companies and other partners. I welcome all the star-studded industry stalwarts for this great session. I thank them for giving their time and effort for this panel discussion, which is an important subject matter at the present point, where IBC and the effective resolution process and transactional audit in IBC are being looked upon as a critical part of India jurisdiction itself. While our subject matter is on legal outlook on effective resolution process and transactional audit in IBC, we are going to discuss various specific questions from my panelists on one is about elucidating the techniques to avoid procedural setbacks of CIRP. Number two is running the liquidation process pitfall to watch for. Liquidation process itself was a separate issue for discussion, but point is that we thought that it's a value add to this process when we are discussing about IBC itself. We would be discussing about decoding the tax implication while liquidation process, and we would also speak about section 230 versus going concern versus liquidation. The third subject we are going to discuss is about key success factors to an effective section 29A due diligence to avoid the risk of ineligibility. Forensic technique to circumvent PUFE transactions during resolution process, and implications of recent IBC amendments and suspensions in the wake of COVID-19 outbreak and the opportunities therein. And finally, any suggestions or recommendations from my panel, which is an expert panel on IBC, on any value add they would like to see either in the law or any amendment or in the ease of doing business, the operational efficiency part of the IBC in the courts of law. With that, we'll complete the session for the audience. I go to the first round of the questions, 5 minutes to my panelist per question. I would first start with Mr. Aravind Balajee. He's Vice President Legal for Adani Group. Aravind, the question is that a lot has been spoken about Section 29A. What are the latest legal developments with respect to interpretation of Section 29A that promoters and companies should be aware of to avoid risk of ineligibility? Aravind.
Hi, Zameer. Thanks very much for introducing all of us and kickstarting this session. Frankly, as I think Section 29A has been the hot button issue in IBC since its inception. And actually, this is a question that I myself wanted to ask and get inputs from the other members of the panel. I think the significant development in this regard has been the decision in the SR Steel matter, and which emphasized the importance of the business connection between family members of the promoter family, and especially in India, given that the business sector is dominated by several business families, this has always been a significant issue in that there's a lot of linkage amongst business families and Section 20. And although there was no genuine real business relationship between some promoters and their family members, they would get caught and face the risk of ineligibility under Section 29A, and this has been clarified in the SR decision. I would of course like to request the other panel members if they want to share any additional thoughts on the recent developments in this regard.
Any member who wants to add on Section 29A?
Thanks, Zameer and Aravind. I mean, it's a very, very important issue. It has changed the whole dynamics of how the resolution happens in a debt resolution space. So therefore, the definition of 29A assumes importance. And as Aravind rightly said, that Supreme Court has brought in a concept of business connection while interpreting Section 29A. That was a much needed clarification because in the Indian context, you will have business families who may not have business ties, but they may still be falling within the definition of connected persons. So very rightly, Supreme Court has said that, connected would mean somebody who comes together, they're doing something in concert. That would be constituted as a connected person. And merely because somebody is related will not make it as a connected person. But other than the aspect of, the business connection, one other important aspect that the Supreme Court has touched upon, not in the SR Steel judgment, which came in late 2019, but in late 2018, again in the same transaction of ArcelorMittal, where Supreme Court said that while you determine the issues around Section 29A, you have to pierce the corporate veil.
Yeah.
And piercing the corporate veil is mandated by the legislature itself when it talks about the ineligibility of the connected persons. So if somebody is forming an entity only to submit a plan, with an intent to avoid the ineligibility under 29A, in those cases, the resolution professional who has the primary role of looking at the eligibility issue will have to look through the applicant, examine the connected persons and determine whether they form concert or not. So if any of the connected person who has the business connection is determined to be having any of the ineligibility under Section 29A, they will also be ineligible. So I think both these very important issues that Supreme Court has touched upon, we are yet to see how the jurisprudence develops, because while Supreme Court has mentioned that a connected person would be somebody who has a business connection, but the degree to which the ineligibility would apply or kick in, that is something needs to be developed through the jurisprudence. We yet to see some more cases on this.
Wow, wonderful. I think ArcelorMittal itself was one of the judgments which was seen to be little enlarging the ambit of the scope what was discussed in that scenario. Really made a difference to it. Anjali, now coming to the other side of the coin, one more aspect which has been more discussed is the default threshold. And would it have been better if the government would have raised the default threshold in a graded manner, or probably in a differential manner sectoral wise? Or is it an equality comfort zone which the government has considered without considering the reality of the sectoral part of it? What's your thought about it?
I think, Zameer, this is, raising the threshold level. It has been the talk of the town even prior to the pandemic itself. I think if you go through the MS Sahu speech or otherwise publications by the IBC, they have definitely indicated the raising of thresholds. And I think the government has done it in the wake of pandemic itself. And now it's really hard to evaluate as to whether it is prompted by COVID or it is just the strategic move by the government. But yeah, definitely, if I think it would have been really better if we would have opted for graded or sectoral raising of thresholds, because I think the different sectors like the hospitality, aviation, all of them are affected in a very disproportionate manner, right? And because of the raising of the threshold, the hospitality sector and the aviation and the travel, I think they have definitely anticipated a sigh of relief. But at the same time, I think IT sector or the FMCG, they don't deserve any kind of leverages for that matter of fact. And for considering international regimes, I believe we can take the stances of US laws, wherein they have raised the threshold only for small businesses, right? And considering Singapore law, I think they have made the differential threshold for personal and the businesses insolvencies. So that is one thing which I think we could have definitely opted for. But otherwise, MSMEs, if I see MSMEs as the operational creditors, then definitely they're not really happy with the move. But see, low thresholds are always meant to ensure, the safety of the small suppliers or the timely payments. But considering the pandemic, I think we need to have a macro analysis. We need to have a macro view. And for that matter of fact, I think we have perfectly taken this view. And IPR, IBC, we have, much being like, it has acted much being like a CPR system, wherein it has now been operationalized to the present crisis, to prevent liquidation of the firms, which is much like the organ donation, right?
Okay.
So I think, yeah.
So I think you feel it's a COVID-19 addressing of the situation at a macro level. Otherwise, it would have been customized for the industry, or there would have been a thought process to it also. That's
Definitely,
what
I'm
you think.
waiting for the MSME framework and the prepackaged thing. So I think that is going to add a good thing.
Okay. Ritesh, going to the third area, which always remains in the news, is the CIRP process and the key tax consideration that arise or which should be borne in mind while participating in the CRP process. What are the key tax consideration one should bear in mind while they are participating in the CIRP process? Your thoughts about it?
Sure, Zameer. Like you rightly said, most of these resolutions invariably hinge upon a certain commercial aspect of how assets are being looked at, how loans are being waived off, etc. And to that extent, speaking of it from a tax perspective, there are a few, at least prima facie issues that one may perhaps consider is take, for example, CIRP processes which involve waiver of debt. Now, ordinarily, waiver of debt or converting of debt into equity has consequential tax consequence. In that sense, a waiver may very well trigger tax liability under Section 41(1) of the Act, which requires the company to pay tax on the liability that is being waived off. Similarly, when you converted debt into equity, there are considerations around 56(2)(10), popularly referred to as the gift tax provisions. And to that extent, measuring commercial advantages over the, in some sense, a clinical approach adopted by tax laws, sort of one point of caution on that, because it is likely that you may breach the technical requirement of the income tax law, whereas that piece becomes commercially essential to solve it. Second is consider a situation where certain shares are being issued at a premium as a compromise, or say at a discount as a compromise to the incoming buyer. Now, those transactions, in India, unfortunately, both ways, where shares get issued at a premium, which premium is above the book value in case of equity shares, makes the company liable for tax at the rate of 34% or 25%. And equally, when the shares are issued at a discount, there is a view that the recipient of such shares is likely to suffer tax charge on the differential. So essentially on the amount representing the discount, there may be a tax charge. Consider, from a process perspective, also that, somewhere in the IBC, you may have to deal with a couple of tax claims. There may be outstanding tax demands from an income tax perspective, from a GST perspective, from an erstwhile VAT perspective. And, very clearly under the IBC law, the ranking given to the payment schedule, tax authorities are not given any priority in terms of collection. But very often post such resolution plans, we've encountered situations where the tax authorities come knocking on the premise that these liabilities pre-existed, etc. While there are judicial precedents which settle this view, I think it is appropriate from a CIRP process perspective to consider some of these tax consequences or procedural matters as you go through the process, because unfortunately today the law is fairly nascent, and until the law carves out specific exclusions, all of these will be an important or an essential check the box for the CIRP process.
I think that's a very important value add in that. But there have been judgments to that, as you said. Even Supreme Court has gone into it. But still, you have this tax liability and inquiries which are going on. Something which gets up even at a later stage, post-transactional, is sometimes an issue because there is a provision under the law, and therefore the authorities move in that direction. Very rightly pointed out.
The only thing, Zameer, if I may add, there are judicial precedents both at the Supreme Court level and including at the High Court level, and most jurisdictions cover it today. The question is, when you're resolving an asset issue, do you really want to get into litigation post that resolution, right? The objective somewhere is defeated when you have to continue litigation post the resolution. So that's really where I'm coming from.
No, I completely agree with you on that. So moving from the CRP subject, Ramanand, my next question is to you. We have the transactions which are there, preferential, undervalued, fraudulent, extortionate transaction, PUFE as we call. What could be the forensic techniques to circumvent PUFE transactions during the resolution process? What's the mechanism by which you can discover and unearth that when things are so sophisticated in today's date? Your views on that?
Yeah, thank you. In fact, before coming directly to the technique, firstly, just I am in the interest of the viewer, like to share what are the circumstances under which forensic auditor getting recommended by the appropriate authority. As we know, as per Section 20 of the IBC Act, the resolution professional have been empowered to appoint an auditor, accountant, or legal to take care of their duty, which has been empowered for the resolution professionals. Secondly, history. If you see the history of this case, as well as with respect to forensic audit, we have noted number of fraudulent transactions which has been in almost thousands plus company, and total worth of the amount, if you see the fraudulent transactions which has been discovered, it is 100,000 crores plus. This is how the magnitude of the things which has been discovered by the forensic audit. And that is why that's why the significance of forensic audit has been increased drastically with respect to IBC and others. Of course, if you see forensic audit also, there are again, based on the magnitude of the transactions, the circumstances of the case-to-case basis, because every audit or every case cannot be recommended for entire full-fledged forensic audit. There may be forensic audit with respect to your background check, with respect to the financial irregularity, with respect to the holistic due diligence. As we know, under a section under the IBC, as we know, preferential transactions. As it name shows, preferential by the name, it indicates if it is not done on arm's length price, the transaction which is not done on arm's length price with a related party or key managerial person, and companies under the same management, all these are forming part of related party transactions. So just to see if it is being taken place 2 years prior to the date of insolvency, if it is related party. If it is non-related party, then 1 year prior to the date of insolvency. So these are this is with respect to the preferential. Similarly, if you see in case of preferential transactions, then how property, interest or benefit, particular creditor. Sometimes what happens, you have transferred and did legal these things agreement in such a way that once things get into insolvency, then after liquidation, he get the preferential distribution. So whether it has been taken care or not. Similarly, if you see section 45 to 49 of the IBC, there also we find how things are getting undervalued. If any transactions having a market value is higher, and if it is done at the lower price, depend upon the particular circumstances and item, different techniques are getting used. That is for to unearth the accuracy of the things, legal understanding of the particular case. Similarly, when you go up to section 50 of this IBC, there also it is ascertaining the nature of receipts, that financial or operational debts, whether parties who have been granted loan, are they directly or indirectly associated with the related party? One instance is taking a different from when we do forensic audit, then forensic audit is like in operational things we say why analysis. So forensic audit, see in every case, why you go with the case to case basis, how we, and then you get, because there is no single solution or single technique for any these cases. Similarly, you see concealment of property, or when we are transferring share. from one company to change the ownership, share or security. So in that case also, what is the interest of the promoters, how things have been taken, whether it has been considered that unfavorable transaction, is there any loopholes with respect to Benami transactions, or that is a Prevention of Money Laundering Act. So there is multiple aspects which deals with to take care of these things. Any willful omission, let us see sometime what happens. Employer are not supporting you to get the complete books of accounts. How will you do? Particularly when you go for the different the company which is not having the good corporate governance, and even if they are not using ERP package. See, ERP I am specifically highlighting because if there is no ERP package, then you will be not having log of transaction. And if not log of transaction, it means accuracy of transaction itself is a questionable. And in IBC and high-level fraudulent issue, you see the involvement of senior management are involved. It's not the normal transactions where you will get the complete inaccurate bogus entry, manipulation, even documents which is given to you is not accurate. So as a forensic audit, we also have to say one is a three-way matching which we are ensuring in normal audit process. So what could go wrong, even with respect to how people are having their social status, their media. So you get multiple information from their bank, their social media profile, their Google and the things which are. So in forensic audit, we gather information from various areas. Data integration, because data integration is extremely important. Otherwise, we will not be able to prove the case in the court of law. In discussion, we can argue. But when matters comes before the court, there it has to be the chain of custody. How you are going to prove it? So to create a chain of custody, you need to also use various technology, that is data analytical tools or forensic tools to establish the chain of custody. Further, as an auditor, we should not be expecting you are alone, you can perform the entire things, because you need expertise from different field. Like, see, suppose something has been done, whether material is of the right quality or not, the price which is paid to the particular material is justified on an arm's length basis or not. The kind of service which is provided, it is in line with what has been developed or is placed there or not.
Okay.
So whether market item which has been procured, it is on arm's length or based on the normal market price. So we need to take, or we take help of the different professionals who are expertise in these areas, and these are all together we are making that is summarized outcomes basis of our this forensic investigation, and finally that it totality creates chain of custody which can be acceptable to any court of law.
Okay, but I think the three indicators which I got from you is, number one, you look out for the indicators itself. What are the indicators which are showing in that direction? Number two, you have your checklist, what you spoke out. And the third is your invention is why and why. So that's one of the things which have to be kept in mind as a chartered accountant in a proficiency. So we spoke about Section 29A on the due diligence part of it. We spoke whether the default threshold at the moment by the government without any graded manner or sectoral is because of the COVID-19 situation, and the government has taken a macro view on that. We also saw on the CIRP process, and we saw that how preferential or undervalued transactions, etc., and the forensic can be an identifiable factor. The most important also thing is that while timeline seems to be great in all the aspects of life, in IBC, it's a contentious issue whether timeline should be mandatory, because IBC is looked from a different contextual point of view. Anoop, this question to you, whether the timelines prescribed under the IBC should be made mandatory for effective resolution process. Go ahead.
Yeah, Zameer, one of the key objectives of the IBC is a time-bound resolution and revival of the corporate data. Not only does the premise of timely resolution set apart the IBC from any alternative mode of recovery, but is also a principle that underscores the IBC for successful completion of a CIRP, while ensuring that the value of the assets does not erode. But we have seen, that in the past, the processes have suffered from massive delays, which inevitably leads to a reduction in the value of assets and the inability of the corporate debtor to continue as a going concern. Now, from a legislation perspective, the code did start with a requirement of completing the process within a period of 180 days and with an extension of 90 days to be granted by the adjudicating authority. When this started, everybody was actually very serious about the timelines. People actually thought that it's a one-way road, and at the end of 270 days you just have to die, and you have to face the liquidation, and that's how it started. But gradually, because of the institutional shortcomings, because of I would say the lack of clarity on the procedural aspects, the delays started happening. Now, one would assume that, with the passage of time, the clarity would come and the procedural aspects would get sorted. And we have, in fact, successfully managed to get immense clarity on some of the key aspects of the insolvency resolution process. And Supreme Court has come out with great judgments, in SR Steel, JP, in Dharani Sugar, in Swiss Ribbon, and others. They have come out with absolute clarity on some of the aspects. The committee of creditors have been entrusted the role of deciding on the plan. The commercial wisdom cannot be challenged, and all of that. With that, one would have assumed that now we will have much more efficiency in the processes. But unfortunately, what we have noticed is that the timelines have actually further deteriorated. We have cases which are languishing for more than 1,000 days. We have cases where the admission has not happened for 6-7 months, and this is unpardonable. I mean, one default which is very evident. The only thing that you need to do in a admission case is to just prove the default. And once you have the proof of default of more than the threshold, now 1 crore rupees, it must be admitted. There's no way why it should languish for 5-6 months. So I would say that there are definitely areas which needs improvement from a legislative perspective also, and from a judicial pronouncement perspective also. From legislative perspective, I think we need to very clearly bring out the intent that even the various steps involved in the processes, they are the timelines are mandatory. For certain things which cannot be put into a time compartment, like time spent in the litigations and all, that we understand that even Supreme Court has clarified that you cannot make it mandatory when it comes to excluding the period of time taken in litigation, because courts can do no harm. But at the same time, the other activities and the other things which are part of the process, there needs to be absolute clarity that these are mandatory. Then from a judiciary perspective, I think the NCLTs, their functioning need to improve. I mean, these days, they give exclusion on drop of the hat. Of course, the intent being that you need to make all the efforts that are necessary to revive the company rather than letting it go to the liquidation. But at the same time, it should not come at the cost of a time-bound process, because time is everything. When the company goes into an insolvency process, it is in ICU, and therefore it needs to quickly come out of that ICU. And how do you do that? By running a very, very quick process. Because what happens, when you are in the insolvency resolution process, the RP do not get into the issues of capital improvement of the facilities, which is very, very important from a long-term perspective for a company. So he manages the company, keeps it as a going concern, but none of the improvements are happening. So, so just imagine that, in all the cases where the processes are going on for, let us say, 7 to 8 months, no substantial economic activity in terms of, adding to the capacity is not happening at all. And no new capital is coming in. So you need to quickly, turn around a company. And from that perspective, I think NCLT is also, to the extent possible, avoid the delays, come up with the, approval orders quickly. We have seen cases where the plans have been filed for approval, but there is no hearing happening. Of course, substantial reason would be the COVID constraints now. But now, the adjudicating authorities have got used to the video conferencing. I think there is no reason why an effective hearing can happen. So I think the delay on that account need to be reduced. So faster admission, the faster approval of the plans, and declogging of the NCLTs as far as some of the non-plan related issues are concerned. And one is what we just discussed, is the preferential, undervalued, and the fraudulent transactions.
Very well.
A lot
Very
of,
well.
Which will require a lot of fact finding. It requires a lot of arguments on the actual merit of the allegation. We have not seen lots of cases where NCLTs have actually gone into detail, have done a deep dive into these issues, because they're meant to do this. So therefore, I think specialized specialized courts, specialized agency needs to take up those matters separately, and NCLT should be focusing more on the faster approval of the plans.
I think well said. I was more on the diplomacy side, so I thought you'll say about balancing, then I thought you'll say about fine tuning, but I think you said it all in both better language, because that will, of course, that's the exception is the judicial process time which is involved in that. But I think these are the three streams what you said on the faster hearing. I think that can be really taken up, because it overall then portrays the jurisdiction and the law also in the right spirit, when it comes before the discussion. Aravind, going to you, Ritesh highlighted the key tax consideration that arise and should be borne in mind while participating in a CIRP process. Any recent issues of significance in the area of tax in the context of either the CIRP or the liquidation process that the practitioners should be aware of? Aravind.
Thanks, Zameer. To be frank, I think I would defer to the tax experts, Mr. Jain and Ritesh, on this. I would, at least in terms of recent developments, I think Ritesh has already discussed some of them, but I can't think of anything that I would like to highlight for discussion in this panel, but I would defer to the tax experts here.
I think they expressed the view. I think Ritesh also said it specifically, and Mr. Jha also went into it sometime, but I think Ritesh spoke very elaborately on the subjects, including the enforcement effects, which comes as an after effect, afterthought, aftershock, whatever you call it. Anjali, going to you, keeping in line with the spirit of the amendments we discussed about the default threshold, etc. How much have COVID prompted amendments in the IBC being effective in revival of economies, if we see such similar amendments in the international scenario or from an international scenario also in comparison? What's your thought about it?
So what I think is this, that it's too early to answer this question right now, as if we talk about the revival of economies, because the post-COVID situation is not yet arisen. But still, I think any enactment and the edifice around it, it has to constantly reorient itself to keep the infrastructure going. And I think our government has very brilliantly did it in a manner and created the conducive environment for the perfect interplay of the enactments as well as the economic turnarounds. I would definitely want to add that here, Indian government has of course witnessed a collapse in the Indian economy has of course witnessed a collapse in the last quarter, but still I think revival signs are being reflected, and even RBI is saying that we are on the stage of being on the reviving economies, and the shares of banks, ICICI and Axis, I think they are soaring up to good 6 to 7%, and even the hospitality sector shares, they are soaring high. So good signs of revivals are definitely there. And talking about international, like US, even I think they are operating at almost 82% of where it was in early March. So even there are good signs of revival. And if I talk about particularly insolvency regime amendments, then I believe more or less all of them have followed the same trends, as in relation to raising of thresholds or suspension of suspension of the insolvencies or the relaxation in the director's duties. So all of them have almost followed the same norms. Talking about US, I think they have infused the biggest economic stimulus package of around good 2 trillion, I believe, and wherein now they are also offering employment benefits or the protecting small businesses. And if I talk about Germany, then they have introduced holistic comprehensive package and called the German bazooka for the insolvent companies so that they can keep going on. So all these measures are basically ensuring that the company can be revived, that the economy can be revived basically. So and companies, I think as entities, they need to take this opportunity, and they need to these big avenues, the new avenues that are now presented. I think they can take this advantage only and only if they have a thoughtful restructuring plan, and that too in the long term, for the long term thing.
I agree. I think we should really appreciate the role of Indian government and the other governments who have taken this initiative, because the government themselves were in a tangent situation where this COVID-19 was hitting the economy left, right, and center, and government has to look from top to bottom. When the government is also introducing these measures in terms of law, is something which the governments have thought through it, and they have done it. Is an excellent job at this point of time in the scenario when they are also preoccupied with 100 other things which are affiliated to COVID-19. US had a great stimulus. The last one is stuck up. Thankfully, the elections are over. But I think in the realistic scenario, what we saw the government of India acting upon it, they have done a fair job on these amendments which have come from a overall economic perspective, not from a sectoral perspective, which you said at lastly.
Yeah, but just one comment there, Zameer. I think what we also need to have a realistic, view of whether the measures have sort of been successful, and what we need to do to correct. Course, we need to do a course correction as well. If you look at the suspension specifically, you see the suspension was meant to provide some relief to the companies which might be undergoing stress because of COVID. But at the same time, whether the alternate resolution platform have worked or not, that also need to be seen. And if they are not, then there is no point kicking the can down the road, because you will see the accumulation of stress at the end of 6 months, and then you will suddenly see the deluge of cases in NCLT, and then again the same problem. So I think we need to have a practical view as well.
Yeah, I think overall what you're coming from a perspective is that this is a chain reaction. In fact, that was one of the deliberations and discussions we had, that when you make some amendments or where you have some impact or anything coming from government or courts, it's a chain reaction which is happening, and how fast is the chain and how far it will reach is a discussion, I think, which Anjali also said that I think it will be time tested. Who wanted to add anything?
Hi, Zameer. Hi, this is, I just wanted to make 2 points in this regard. In the context of the amendments, in the context of COVID, that the government enacted to the IBC. I mean, my personal take on that is, I think, of course, the government was very keen to make sure that companies continue as going concerns. And my view, probably they went a little overboard. I think the amendment, or let me just talk of, let's say, Section 10A, which was newly introduced, which legislated that proceedings cannot be initiated under Section 7, 9, and also under Section 10, which is a voluntary bankruptcy proceeding. So, let's, they may be, so that I think application to Section 10 was probably not required. Perhaps there were companies and businesses out there which, which were facing a downturn in their cash flow because of COVID. Perhaps they wanted to offer what the voluntary proceeding so that they get the benefit of the moratorium. We don't know. I guess the legislative change was enacted to, with a broad policy being, well, we want all companies to be going concerns. Nobody should resort to insolvency proceedings even if it's not voluntary. So I think that is one point. And I think another point which I think was also referred to earlier in the panel regarding, the exemptions given to directors in the context of insolvency with respect to compliance with their duties and their fiduciary duties towards the creditors. So we also have this amendment to Section 66, Clause 2, which effectively, I think there's a non-obstante clause which now exempts, which makes that clause inapplicable to directors for actions taken by the directors during this 6-month suspension, which has now been further extended till December. I mean, at least in my view, that it is important to, while these are tough times, and it is important to give relief to distressed businesses and companies. It is also important to highlight the importance of compliance. The directors following their fiduciary duties, and when they are aware that there is an imminent risk of insolvency, it's also important to highlight the message that they should act as per their duties to minimize the risk to the lenders. So at least in my view, I think that was probably a little very, very, I mean, it was of course very pro the corporate sector, the promoters, and giving assurance and comfort to businesses and business owners that, well, the apple cart will not be upset. But I think on these two aspects, perhaps it was not strictly speaking necessary, but I guess I think the overall impact has of course been positive and necessary to give succor to the economy and help it revitalize.
Yeah, there were discussions on political, economic. DRT guys had heartburned, but I think this was specially introduced from an IBC perspective. Yeah, Ritesh, your views on that?
Well, I mean, just to sort of add on to what Anoop mentioned, right? Saying once this freeze is lifted, you'll have a whole spate of filings in the NCLT, going through that resolution, etc. And the idea of being practical, I think somewhere introducing a cooling period that sort of allows you to temper off from the downfall, right? Because you really don't expect demand to pick up immediately. And where we are at early signs, clearly there is, too much of capital accumulation, very little on the demand and the expenditure piece. So if you were to sort of give that kind of a window, which allows for some restoration from the downturn, even if you assume it's a V-shaped recovery, I suppose giving that cooling off window to sort of come back up to form a V or a U could sort of be practically subject to, some interim process rather than having to go through a full-fledged CIRP and sort of waiting through those extensive 1,000-day timelines, that we sort of discussed earlier.
Could you outline the position under our existing tax laws that govern the liquidation process in India, Ritesh, just on a continuation side, while addressing the tax questions and keeping tax considerations of CIRP process in mind? Your thoughts on that, just a reflection on it while we are talking about these amendments.
Right. I think, once the CIRP fails, you go through the process of liquidation. There are a couple of considerations really, right? But just about to take a step back in terms of the CIRP or post-CIRP pre-liquidation kind of an era, if, there are a couple of points that I think it's worth mentioning. One is, if there are transfer of assets, for example, from, the company into the person who is entitled to receive consideration on account of a debt, etc. Today, under the income tax law, while all of this is done bona fide for the purposes of settlement, there are provisions under 281 of the income tax law which allow tax officer to challenge the bona fides so long as there is a pre-existing demand. And, practically we've encountered situations where merely because a tax officer has issued attachment orders, under, the TRO, the tax recovery procedure, prior to this process or, alongside this process, notwithstanding the overarching prohibition under the IBC, the question comes, how do I give effect to the transfer itself? And given that there is general distress and you're exiting a certain business, how do you deal with this kind of a peculiarity? Then you end up going to the High Court seeking relief, etc. So that said, on the pre-liquidation stage, on the liquidation process itself, the way our current income tax law is structured is any distributions made to shareholders are taxable as dividends to the extent there is accumulated profit on the balance sheet of the entity. Where there are no accumulated profit, any repatriations made will be taxed as capital gain. Of course, if you collect less than what you invested, which is very likely all situations of CIRP failing liquidations, you will encounter a situation where the receiver is entitled to record a capital loss. And purely from a process perspective, the law requires you to issue an intimation to the tax authorities under 178, and the tax authorities having to give you some form of a no objection certificate, or so to say that no amount shall be set aside for the purpose of distribution to the income tax authorities. Similar provisions also exist with within the GST law, but if you see the IBC process, there is an amendment which has an overriding impact on 178. But practically, we've not seen tax officers get comfortable. We've seen situations where they've objected to the tax, or they've objected to liquidation on the pretext of tax demands in the NCLT process. Thereby, that extends the process of liquidation also. The second thing that you'd rather be careful about in terms of tax aspects of a liquidation is what happens once the entity is wound up by means of an order of the NCLT. But there is pre-existing tax litigation, right? So again, the income tax law is fairly silent. There is no specific mechanism which allows for that litigation to die a natural death. But there is sufficient jurisprudence, including the decision of the Supreme Court in the Maruti matter, which seems to suggest that once the entity ceases to exist, the litigation cannot be carried forward. Now, speaking of this, this aspect, and if you look at the income tax tribunal rules, there is a specific provision which says that notwithstanding such cessation of the entity, the litigation may be carried forward. So practically, as you exited the business, as you sort of, as shareholders, when you exited the company, your tax litigation does not really die away. So is it therefore advisable to get no objection under 178 without prejudice to the provisions of the IBC, so that tomorrow, as past directors or past shareholders, there is no fallback on you from the tax office? So those are some practical aspects that, on a case-to-case basis, at least, one must consider before sort of you take a look at the liquidation process.
Well, I think today we had a tremendously great discussions on many aspects which are really critical and cardinal to the IBC law we are discussing about. Ramanand, if I go to you from a tax position to a practicality of the view, since we spoke about forensic, now we come down to the practical area. What are your views on Section 230 versus a going concern, or a slum sale you call it, versus liquidation? What are your views, and what's the position you would take?
Like in under Section 29, if we see under Section 29 prohibits a promoter to part in a resolution plan, which is not happening as per the Section 230 of the Companies Act. Since Section 230 of the Companies Act, it is allowing the promoters or creditors to agree to form an arrangement so that company control can be transferred from one stakeholder to the other stakeholders. Objective is to continue its going concern, that is objectivity. Because if company get shut down. So then all stakeholders, their liability, responsibility, and multiple things with respect to taxation and other things keeps coming. Yes, after this amendment in 2019 IBC, they have prescribed 90 days period. You have to get it completed within 90 days from the date of the liquidation. So that is another thing which has been done by. When we go for going concern, see, going concern initially it has been introduced or it is practiced in the Companies Act. When we sign the balance sheet, every annual report you see, first we start with the going concern, that is assumption. So in case of going concern assumption, we see that assets and liabilities are recorded on the basis that entity will be able to realize its assets and discharge its liability in normal course of business. So if it is not justified, in that case, we need to do adjustment if there is any doubt with respect to going concern, with respect to the liability, with respect to the recoverable amount. So entire adjustment, you have to make the complete provision if there is any doubt on the going concern. Similarly, when we move to this IBC, in IBC amendment, what happens in 2018? They are saying that you consider companies as if going concern as it was prior to the CIRP, these things. So one assumption is for Companies Act and other assumption is to keep going concern of the company to in continuation of IBC. Objective is to sustain the company as long as possible in the interest of all stakeholders. When we go for liquidation part, in a liquidation, see, it is only starting with the defaulter. If somebody is defaulting, then it is that is from the part of the creditors and others. They complain with us NCLT. Again, if it is sustained, their request is acceptable and all those things are process are being followed, which is getting recommended by if NCLT, then they are forming the interim professionals appointment. Again, committee of creditors are supposed to take care of because they are the one whose interest needs to be protected at large, whether it is a financial creditor or secured creditor or non-financial creditors. Fortunately, now after judgment of Supreme Court and other one previous courts also judgment, now that is buyer, at least home buyer are part of the secured, that is a financial creditors. Otherwise, they were not only bank and other secure creditor were taken the privilege for the same. So this is how in a liquidation process. So liquidation is at the last, if nothing is left, go for it and give the preference to the stakeholders who are the having the first privilege right.
I agree. I think enlarging it to the flat holders, flat buyers right now has really enlarged the ambit of IBC. For the industry, it's one more zone in addition to RERA, if applicable to the real estate industry. One more addition to by adding up and giving powers to the flat buyers under the IBC. You reach a resolution process, Anoop. There is a resolution process going on. You are on the finality of it. You feel whether withdrawal or modification of resolution plans really acts as an impediment or it's damaging or it's discouraging to the effective resolution process? What's your view on that?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the principle is that, it has to be a time-bound process. And the reason why it is a time-bound process, because, at the end of the prescribed period, the company has to be revived and it has, the new management has to come in. And therefore, it cannot be, in a perennial state of being under administration. Therefore, anybody putting the plan, wasting the time and resources of committee of creditors, resolution professional, judiciary, and after that withdrawing, I mean, that definitely undermines the, the principles of insolvency. But at the same time, the law is really not very, very clear on, how the issues of withdrawal will be dealt with. We have a section 74, which, prescribes criminal, prosecution, jail term, or the fine. But that's a very long drawn process, and you have to go through a session courts process to get a conviction. None of that has happened in India today. We have had cases where complaints have been filed. We also have a big question mark on how it will be initiated once a withdrawal happens. And withdrawal also have different facets. Withdrawal can happen once you put the plan and COC has not approved the plan, then you withdraw. You can also, there can be a withdrawal after the COC has approved the plan and NCLT has not approved. Or third, the withdrawal could happen from the time that NCLT approves the plan and before the plan is implemented. Now, Section 74 right now only covers situations where NCLT has approved the plan and it is not implemented yet, or even if it is part implemented. But then there are several cases where the plans are before the NCLT or before the COC, and then the resolution applicant withdraws the plan. So far, the only commercial mitigation to that is that you need to prescribe a good amount of a bid bond or a performance bank guarantee, such that if there is any withdrawal, then bid bond can at least sort of give some kind of a financial relief. But so far that has not been proved to be any significant help. Therefore, there need to be a clear rule. There has to be a legislative intervention here, and legislation need to clarify that once the plans have been submitted, COC has approved, there cannot be any withdrawal of that. And Section 74 ambit needs to be broadened to include these cases also, and the process needs to be more strengthened. Right now, there is no deterrence. There are so many resolution applicants who have been frequently withdrawing from the plan, undermining the sanctity of this entire process.
I agree.
So that's really a backward step for us, that if a resolution applicant continue to withdraw and the adjudicating authorities also are not able to find a solution to it.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you. It completely dislodges the resolution process itself, makes a mockery, want to use a lighter word for it. But point is that it completely goes into a different zone. And there are various reasons also affiliated sometimes to the withdrawal, maybe strategic, maybe otherwise. But point is that the whole process and the cards and the effort, time, etc., which has been in the process and in the judicial process is also wasted, and therefore it has to be made little stringent so that there is a deterrence to it. I think you've used the right word of deterrence, so that the process itself is not disrupted. I have the privilege and honor of having the industry experts with me. We go to the next round, which is round 2, a final round. Final comment from everyone, 15 seconds, 20 seconds per person. What are your final thoughts on the gap that needs to be filled in on the law side, or any recommendations for amendments in the law, operational efficiency, or ease of doing business, as we call it here now, you would like to recommend as experienced and well-known members of the legal fraternity and the subject matter? I would first start with Ritesh, then go to Anoop, Anjali, Ramanand, and Aravind. Ritesh.
Thanks. I think, sticking with tax, like I said, the legislation is fairly nascent. I think we should collectively look at providing and enabling legislation from a tax perspective that makes it easier during the CIRP process and the post-CIRP process. Some of those aspects regarding collection of demands and post-conversion tax cost. I think those are the pieces we'd love to see, being liberalized or being clarified by the government, and that's pretty much top of my mind in the context of this discussion.
No.
Yeah, so I will touch upon the issue of Section 230 going concern and liquidation that you mentioned earlier. I think the focus that the government and all these stakeholders should be having is towards the effective resolution. Section 230 going concern and stripping of the asset and selling during the liquidation, that is something that it's completely I would say that it's completely out of sync with the insolvency laws. Section, if a resolution cannot happen in 270 days, how you're going to achieve Section 230 resolution?
I agree.
Or how you're going to sell the company as a going concern. So, and the other downside to having these kind of options in the liquidation is that then people tend to get motivation to move towards liquidation or force the company towards liquidation. I think the initial concept was under the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee report that you need to try and revive the company during the insolvency resolution process period. If it doesn't happen, then it has to necessarily go into liquidation and dissolution. Any other innovative strategy, it's not going to work. And it has not worked, frankly.
So this was IBC in good faith, what we imported and now executed here. I think we are looking forward. Anjali?
Law Reforms Committee report, it's a very skewed, picture right now.
Okay. Anjali?
See, I don't think I can give a short answer to this short question, but still I'll try. I think the major amendments that I would really want to see in this law is in relation to the preferential treatment of the secured creditors at the time of resolution. So they're given equal treatment at the time of resolution. Secured financial creditors, they're given equal treatment with unsecured financial creditors. I'm myself researching a lot upon it as to how the varying security interest can be taken care of at the time of resolution. So I think I will definitely look forward to it. And also I'm looking forward, as I would really want to concur with Mr. Anoop, as he had said that the plans should not be allowed to be withdrawn at such reasonable ease. We have seen the cases of Amtegoto. I think he's so well versed with the case. And also this Kundan Care products, recently it has now been stayed by High Court. So Supreme Court. So I think it is having huge ramification on the industry. And then thirdly, I would definitely want that government companies, they should not be amenable to the insolvency regime. And then definitely I want that out of court restructuring mechanism should be developed over a period of time so that, insolvency regime is developed in a very proper manner.
Great suggestions, I think. Wonderful. Ramanand.
As the entire objective of IBC was to complete the process in a timely manner. Though timeline has been prescribed, but still there are many loopholes which defeat the entire purpose for the benefits of course, firstly, I'll go with the normal people, then with because they are the one who suffers a lot, thereafter with the organization. So whatever loopholes are available for which is creating hurdle in timely completion of these things, whether in part of law, whether in part of judiciary, it has to be minimized to a great extent so that it cannot be misutilized and overall objective of IBC is achieved.
Aravind?
Hi. So the change that I would like to see is in many respects sub judice before the Honorable Supreme Court. The change that I would like to really see is clarity on the law with respect to initiation of proceedings against guarantors, whether they're personal guarantors or corporate guarantors or corporate debtors. I think there have been judicial rulings about which prevent simultaneous initiation of proceedings against corporate guarantors. In the field of personal guarantors, I think it's practically a new area and the Supreme Court is going to rule on it. I believe this is a very important area where we need clarity in the law, either in the form of a judicial decision or an amendment, making it clear that guarantee contracts are respected and honored. Creditors can initiate proceedings against guarantors. I think that will go a long way in instilling discipline in the financial system, and people take contracts seriously, and the contracts can be enforced. So I think it'll go a long way in changing the financial system, the lending business, and the insolvency system in India if we have clarity on that.
Very important connected issue in terms of the loans which have been granted by the creditors or the transactional creditors. I think it's really a privilege and honor for me to be with this esteemed learned panel. If the audience have any questions to it, we'll be certainly answering those questions. And once again, I sincerely thank all the panel members personally from the bottom of my heart from being there and sparing your time and your very learned views as an experts on the subject matter. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you once again.
Thank you, panelists, for the deep discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, you can visit the help center in the lobby for any query related to this event. Keep tweeting using the hashtag #ETLegalWorld. Stay tuned.